This is, again, chapter 9 from We Left Jehovah's Witnesses. Edmond Gruss wrote this specific chapter after the testimonies that comprise the majority of the book. This is on page 144 about the period from 1920 to 1929. Published late in 1920, Rutherford's Millions Now Living Will Never Die booklet and the campaign which promoted it created quite a stir. The essence of this new stress was that the kingdom would be set up in 1925. Now he has a direct quote from the Millions book, usually called a booklet. Page 97 of the Millions book says this: based upon the argument heretofore set forth, then that the old order of things, the old world, is ending and is therefore passing away, and that the new order of things is coming in, and that 1925 shall mark the resurrection of the faithful worthies of old and the beginning of reconstruction, it is reasonable to conclude that millions of people now on the earth will still be on the earth in 1925. Then, based upon the promises set forth in the divine word, we must reach the positive and indisputable conclusion that millions now living will never die. End of quote. Gruss says, after the quotation and explanation of Isaiah 35 verse 10, Rutherford looked to the immediate future. This is from the same Millions book, page 105. This is the golden age of which the prophets prophesied and of which the psalmist sang, and it is the privilege of the student of the divine word today, by the eye of faith, to see that we are standing at the very portals of that blessed time. Let us look up and lift up our heads. Deliverance is at the door. He actually wrote a book by the title Deliverance the very next year, 26. Gruss says the booklet and the campaign made many new converts, but as 1925 approached, Rutherford became less sure of his predictions, and by early 1925 he had acknowledged the failure of his expectations. In 1929, with the publication of Life, attention was switched from the 1925 failure to a new issue. The premise of this new book was that the time of the end was very close because the Jews were returning to Palestine. And here's a couple of quotes from the text of Life, pages 170 and 332. If the end of 1925 marks the end of the last 50-year period, that is the Jubilees that were the basis of the calculation of the dates 1874, 75, and 1925, then it follows that we should expect the people to begin to receive some knowledge concerning God's great plan of restoration. The Jews are to have the favors first, and thereafter all others who obey the Lord. Later in the book, he says that the return of the Jews to God's favor means the time when God will extend the privileges of life to the people. He used to call, for some reason, the rest of the human race the people, both the dead and the living, so this extends to the dead, is shown by the words written. And then he quotes Romans 11, verses 15 and 16. So that's the great passage in Paul where Paul discusses the ultimate destiny of unsaved and unbelieving Israel. And he is quoting it in favor of the majority of commentators, that is, in agreement with the majority of commentators on Romans, who do say that Paul is not talking about some spiritual Israel in Romans 9 through 11. He's talking about unbelieving Israel. Also, from the same book, that is Life, pages 346 and 47, he says, that foreshadowed God's purpose now to shortly dash to pieces the devil's organization that controls all the nations of the earth, and then bring peace and prosperity to the people. And all they who obey him will be granted life everlasting on the earth. So this is before the great crowd doctrine, but 6 years before. But obviously is well on the way to it. But the Jews have to go first, and they did. Gruss comments the thesis of Life was discarded only about a year after its publication. So of course that led to the 1931 discovery, the new light, that the only Jehovah's Witnesses that mattered to God were those presently alive. all promises to Israel in the Old Testament really applied to spiritual Israel. Gruss goes on, the year 1925 witnessed two other testimonies to the soon end of the world. One was the publication of the book Prophecy. The other was the building of Beth Sarim, House of the Princes in San Diego. In Prophecy, Rutherford stated, quote, Satan knows that shortly he must fight the Lord, and therefore he prepares for the conflict, end of quote. In concluding the chapter on Armageddon, the shortness of the time was again stressed. Here's the direct quote, by the proclaiming of the doings of Jehovah and his purposes, the people may now know the meaning of the present-day events, and what shall shortly come to pass, and what will be for their good. So obviously the message is to that present generation that what's going to happen next is for your good. Of course, all those millions are now dead too. Gruss goes on, Beth Sarim was built to provide a place to which the princes, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and others, might return just before the closing events of the end. The San Diego Sun of March 15, 1930, reported, the 7 famous men will not have long to rest at their San Diego estate, because they soon will lead the forces of the Lord to vanquish the minions of Satan at the Battle of Armageddon, Rutherford believes. And Gruss closes this section with, Beth Sarim was sold by the Society shortly after Rutherford's death in 1942. So the belief that 1925 was chronologically significant, the belief that the Jews were a sign, the return of the Jews to Israel was a sign, and of course Beth Sarim, all these things were dumped later. Another thing that was dumped was the idea that God lived in our universe. In fact, he lived specifically in the constellation of Pleiades. Well, they still believe he's somewhere in the universe, apparently, although that's left more vague nowadays. But certainly haven't clung to this belief that they know where he is in the universe, in the Pleiades. So I'm going to link a video that makes this quite plain from the writings of Rutherford during this very period, the late 1920s. See you soon.